Number 10. Dungeons & Dragons: Honor Among Thieves. When people who haven't played Dungeons & Dragons think about Dungeons & Dragons, they tend to imagine a giant fantasy world full of monsters and spells and dungeons and dragons. What gets left out most of the time is that it's actually a very silly game. This movie is so true to the spirit of Dungeons & Dragons, it feels as though you're just kind of making up a bunch of stuff with your friends. Hugh Grant steals every scene he's in as Forge, really one of the most underrated actors out there, in my opinion. It's weird to be drowning in franchises and series about tertiary Star Wars characters and all that sort of desperate material, and actually leave a movie wanting it to become a franchise. But that is what happened to me. I left this movie and I wanted more. I wanted a spin-off series about Jonathan the Griffin, who everyone exploits because he can fly. Number 9. Past Lives. This is not the polar opposite of a rom-com, but it's a decidedly different, original take on cinematic romance. It's a movie where characters cannot help but be drawn together, and they click on a spiritual level, but they're only peeking through a window of possibility that has long been closed, and they both know it. And Past Lives could have taken the easy way out, making Greta Lee's husband a jerk who doesn't understand her, or framing her romantic fantasy as an escape from an unfulfilling life, but it's so much more interesting than that. And in spite of the endlessly great dialogue, the best writing in this movie is what's left unsaid. Number 8, Killers of the Flower Moon. I hear the argument that this movie should be coming from an indigenous perspective, and obviously on a broader level, movies about the indigenous experience need to exist in far greater numbers, but that is decidedly not the point of Killers of the Flower Moon. It's a movie conceived by white people as a necessary confrontation with the horrific crimes of our past that we continue to benefit from and enable in the present. It's about the roots of our ill-gotten privilege and our continuous complicity. And as one critic said, if this movie was framed entirely from Lily Gladstone's perspective, it would run the risk of a white audience identifying with her struggle and feeling like victims themselves, when we're anything but. It's so amazing to see De Niro playing a horrible person again, because it's just what he's meant to do. It was nice to see him trying again with Silver Linings Playbook and doing a more subdued version of this kind of character in The Irishman, but this kind of raging psychopath is truly his jam. You throw in DiCaprio as this gray but ultimately gross, very original character for him, and Lily Gladstone, who I never forgot from Certain Women. You've got 3 of the best performances of the year stretched out over 3.5 hours, which I'm not going to say it doesn't feel like 3.5 hours, but Scorsese fills that time with gusto. Number 7, The Pigeon Tunnel. John le Carré has lived an absolutely remarkable life, and he's spent a very good chunk of that life processing it, writing books about it, and giving interviews about everything he's learned. And Errol Morris has been interviewing fascinating people his whole life and fine-tuning his methods of interviewing and bringing out the most fascinating dialogue he can with his trademark first-person mimicking in Teratron. This movie is a collaboration between 2 masters who are bringing everything they've got to the table. In the case of Le Carré, it's his final statement. Though I get the sense he's not being 100% transparent about his life, and who could, really? Nothing I say here can match the insight that Errol Morris conjures from him throughout on a minute-by-minute basis. I encourage you to take the ride that Le Carré took a whole lifetime to construct. Number 6, The Killer. They might as well have called this The Fincher. It's such a pure statement of who David Fincher is as an artist and where he's coming from as a technical master who aims to bring all the elements of filmmaking together to make something precise and perfect. But at the end of the day, he is just a guy, and he's never going to be able to divorce himself from his own flaws and his subconscious leanings, and that imperfection is what makes art art. If the nameless killer lived up to his self-imposed Sigma male Terminator vision of himself, this would be a slick, sexy, and utterly pointless short film about a guy taking a shot and not missing. Instead, it's a fascinating anticlimactic character study masquerading as a thriller. Also, the best unofficial adaptation of Hitman I've seen. Number 5, May December. I love movies that delight and disturb in equal measure, and there are so many moments in May December where Todd Haynes is giving me just as much of a reason to cry as he is making me burst into laughter. The Globes nominated this for Best Musical or Comedy, and while I think calling this movie a musical or comedy is a big stretch, its overall tone is so baffling and elusive, I don't really blame them. It would be easier to make a movie about a deeply inappropriate relationship as it unfolds, partly because that's already been done many times. But May December adds that extra twist, that secret sauce that brings out the pain and the absurdity in a vastly more satisfying way, being about an actor preparing to play the role of the abuser. Haynes is so good at letting these characters breathe and giving us multiple equally compelling things to look at in the same frame, trusting us to become the editors. I'm sure the rewatchability of this one is through the roof, and if you like May December, it has a lot of very strong connections to Maps to the Stars, a personal favorite of mine about gross Hollywood babies. Super underrated. Check them both out. Number 4, Anatomy of a Fall. This movie is the deepest dive into a relationship I've seen in some time. It's an autopsy of a marriage via the French justice system. So we're dealing with the most subjective story possible, a crumbling relationship. Why was it crumbling? Who was at fault? There's never just one answer to these questions or one side that's in the right. But because murder may or may not be involved, the court has to attempt to put that story together in the most objective manner possible. And the filmmaking is doing its damnedest to stay unbiased as well, in a story that is just begging for violin music and slow motion and all that stuff that you would expect. No. This is Anatomy of a Fall, and its steadfast restraint is what makes it so unforgettable. It's a movie about the limits of modern documentation and evidence and how little we can truly, objectively know about each other, even our partners. I don't think I've seen a better child performance or dog performance in my life. Anatomy of a Fall would make a really good pairing with Margaret, another movie about systems of organization and justice falling short of assigning responsibility for an unknowable human tragedy. Number 3, The Wonderful Story of Henry Sugar. I know it's technically a short film, but this is a truly special adaptation and the best Wes Anderson movie I've seen in years. He takes this very theatrical mode of storytelling, having the actors recite the text directly to the camera, and it's fascinating which bits he chooses to stage and which he chooses to simply speak out loud. I never would have imagined some of the choices in this adaptation. There's that pivotal scene where Henry throws his money off the balcony, and Anderson never tilts down or shows us the chaos as it unfolds below, giving our imagination enough room to project something even more chaotic and hilarious on top of the off-screen soundscape. It's choices like that that make this version of Henry Sugar just as much Wes Anderson's as it is Roald Dahl's. I loved this story as a kid to the point that I tried to do the meditation into the candle myself, so I've been hyping myself for this one for decades, and it totally lives up to that hype. Number 2, The Zone of Interest. Speaking of choosing what to show and what to leave out, Jonathan Glazer made a movie about the Holocaust without directly showing the atrocities inside of Auschwitz. And even though the subject has already been explored so well cinematically, this is an undeniably brilliant, fresh take. And it works so well not just as a Holocaust movie, but as an evergreen metaphor about continuous shared willful ignorance of pain and suffering in the name of profit and personal comfort. The soundscapes in this movie are so rich with agonizing detail. There's an ongoing sense of misery and dread, in spite of the pleasant-seeming domestic imagery and the muted, exacting frames. It's so immersive and transporting, and it's the kind of movie that justifies the existence of movies in general. Take something we already know so well, change the perspective a little bit, and you can create a work of art that feels essential and awe-inspiring. Honorable mentions: Megan, brilliant horror comedy, also a bit of a stealth musical. Talk to Me. A great concept, great execution, Sophie Wilde, MVP. Origin. An important new perspective on racism in America. BlackBerry. The silly social network. Dream Scenario. Why is Nick Cage, one of the most charismatic actors ever, so good at being the least charismatic person ever? Magic Mike's Last Dance. Worth the ticket for the first dance alone. Godzilla Minus One. The human stuff isn't perfect, but the Godzilla stuff? Oh boy. Dix the Musical. Self-explanatory. Beau is Afraid. Less is more, but the first 90 minutes are a masterpiece. Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse. This is half a movie. It doesn't end on a cliffhanger. It doesn't have a complete, satisfying story arc. It is just literally the setup for the next movie. And when I see the next movie, I will know if this first half of one giant movie was actually as amazing as it seemed. Number 1, Oppenheimer. Yep, I have to give it up for Nolan. Oppenheimer hits really hard on the first viewing, but knowing the shape of the movie going into a second viewing, let me tell you, it hits even harder. It's a staggering achievement from so many angles. It's a massive paradox, looking into the origins of nuclear weaponry as this act of incredible imagination and collaboration and mind-blowing science, but obviously, at the same time, it's nuclear weaponry. And Oppenheimer is the perfect personification of that conflict. He represents the head-on collision of creativity and total destruction, unprecedented scientific collaboration and chaos, genius and blunt, overpowering annihilation. All of these opposites are contained in the same flash of light. I've grown up in a world where the threat of nuclear destruction is just kind of a given. It's this unspoken assumption that we all have in the back of our minds. And Oppenheimer unlocks the why, the how, and perhaps most devastatingly, the who of where we find ourselves today. Until next time, this is Nikki P. I have a degree in film.